Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is another one of our series on ending the drug war. And I'm pleased to have as our guest Ethan Nadelmann, who is executive director at the Drug Policy Alliance, which I consider the premier organization in the country that focuses specifically on ending the war on drugs. Ethan, welcome to our series.
Well, it's good to be honest with you, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you give us your summation of the major reasons why you think the drug war is a bad thing and why you feel it should be ended?
Well, I guess it just boils down to I think that it is ineffective, it is extraordinarily costly, it is counterproductive, and it is immoral. So I could boil down to those four elements. I think that sort of sums it up, right? I mean, basically, the war on drugs has not worked in terms of dealing with the drug problems in our society. It has cost America alone over $1 trillion over the last 40 years. It has generated horrific negative consequences, very much the way alcohol prohibition generated horrific consequences without helping the alcohol problem. And lastly, it's fundamentally immoral. I mean, it's immoral. I mean, our core principle is the one that basically says that people should not be punished for what we put in our bodies, absent harm to others, right? And that the government and my employer, they have no right to determine what I am putting in here if I am maintaining my responsibilities in life. And that core principle, which I see as the civil liberties and human rights principle, is fundamentally violated by the war on drugs. And then you go beyond that, you look at people who are struggling with addiction, and we're not willing to be compassionate about them. We got to punish them, even though they may be struggling in all sorts of ways. So I just think across the board, I mean, ultimately, it's probably the moral element and the immorality of the drug war, which most offends me and most drives me. But the fact that my moral sensibilities also happen to jibe with arguments from a policy perspective, I think is really what's put it all together here.
Yeah, I agree with you on the moral case. Let's save that for later. Let's talk about the utilitarian case. Let's expand on that a little bit. What do you see as the aim of the drug war? You say it's failed. Failed in what sense?
Well, I mean, it failed in terms of its own terms, right? I mean, the drug war, to the extent it claims to have any kind of rational justification, it's about trying to reduce the problems of drug abuse, right? And in point of fact, what you see is that the decision to treat certain drugs, not all drugs, right, but certain drugs as criminal, whereby anybody who has anything to do with them, growing them, selling them, using them, buying them, whatever, is a criminal, and then putting most of our resources as a government in terms of the enforcement side, all of those things have turned out to be remarkably ineffective at dealing with the basic problem of drug abuse. I mean that's I think the most evident argument of them all. So I think that's the biggest failure. To the extent that people say we need to reduce the supply, well, I mean, it is true that making drugs illegal does reduce the availability for those people who are not all that interested in finding them in the first place, right? I mean, there's a whole older generation of Americans who don't know where they can get cocaine or heroin or things like that, right? So it is true that prohibition does reduce the availability a bit, and it does kick the price up, which in theory, from an economist's perspective, would reduce the consumption. But if you look at it big picture, what you see is that anybody interested in obtaining these drugs can. What you see is that the drugs that they obtain are much more costly, which is bad both for the consumer and also for the society at large, because then people have to sometimes do illegal activities to support their habits, right? And what you basically see is that it's just not working at those stated objectives of reducing drug abuse, reducing drug availability.
Yeah, it's really amazing how long this thing's gone on, and they continue doing the same things and proclaiming these record drug busts, but the amount of drugs entering society doesn't seem to change over this long period of time. Can you give us a little bit of a historical perspective on how long this war's been waged somewhat futilely?
Sure. Yeah, although I'll do that in a second, but what you're really making me realize is that one of the things that's so horrifying about Jeff Sessions as Attorney General is it's as if the progress that we've been making, to where it feels like in the last, 10 years, 5 years, and especially in the last few years of the Obama administration, where sanity started to actually seep into, the key discussions, and you actually began to have some kind of evidence-based drug policy and all that. And to have Jeff Sessions come in and he's repeating the same old claptrap that we heard in the 80s and the 90s from, both Republicans and Democrats, Reagan and Bush and William Bennett, the first drug czar, and Charlie Rangel, the chairman of the House Select Committee. I mean, the garbage you were hearing back then, which we had finally kind of delegitimized, and all of a sudden Jeff Sessions is back. It's like reefer madness lives again. I mean, he gave a talk earlier today I saw, and he's trying to resuscitate the drugs and violence connection, as if he doesn't have the brain power to realize that almost the entire drug violence connection is a result of drugs being illegal. Right? I mean, if cigarettes were illegal, you'd have a massive cigarette violence connection, right? When alcohol was illegal, there was a massive alcohol violence connection. We don't have those connections between cigarettes and violence now. And with alcohol, the violence is about, people getting drunk. It's not about the markets. But Sessions is trying to resuscitate the whole stupid way of thinking. But I mean, the truth is, of course, you asked me about the history. This goes back. I mean, look, drug wars have been going on for hundreds of years, maybe if not thousands, right? All sorts of peoples and nations and religions have chosen to ban one substance or another. There were wars over tea and wars over coffee and wars over, all this sort of stuff. But the modern drug war, I mean, it really dates back, I think, in America. It sort of starts off in the late 19th century when you have the immigration of the Chinese to America. And people are flipping out and they're xenophobic and they associate the Chinese with their opium habits. So the first opium prohibition laws in America are in Nevada and California in the 1870s and 80s. And they're all about, targeting and demonizing the Chinese. The first cocaine prohibition laws are in the South at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's all about the fear of black men snorting this white powder, and who knows, they'll forget their proper place in racist American society and do terrible things to our women and children. The first marijuana prohibition laws were in the teens and the 20s in the West and the Southwest, and it was all driven by bigotry and, again, fear of Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants. I mean, so there's always been this tremendous ethnic, racial, xenophobic element in America, and really actually many other countries as well. In fact, if you think alcohol, what was alcohol prohibition? It was essentially a broader social conflict between the white Americans and the not so white Americans, right? The white Americans coming from Northern and Western Europe in the 18th, early 19th century, and the not so white Americans coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, bringing their booze and their vino and their Schlivowitz, right? I mean, so there's always been that kind of ethnic, racial dimension to it, right? I mean, if you ask the basic question, why are some drugs legal and others not? What you realize is that the reason has relatively little to do with the relative risks between the substances, and a lot more to do with who uses and who is perceived to use particular substances, right? And when the substances that are, I mean, there was a line in my TED talk that I said, if you think about it, if Viagra were primarily consumed by young black men, and if cocaine was primarily smoked by older white men, well, the odds are that Viagra would get you 5 to 10 years for selling it, and smokable cocaine would maybe get you a slap on the wrist and a visit to the clinic, right? I mean, and I'm exaggerating, but just a bit when I say that. So I think the origin of the drug will go back to that. And then, of course, it's Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and launching a drug war, and with all of his kind of racist and other demonizing, and not just blacks, but jazz musicians and counterculture. And then Richard Nixon, seeing that this was a way to play on the fears about young people and the fears about black people in the late 60s, early 70s. I think it was Nelson Rockefeller in the 70s, the New York governor, getting scared of, the drug thing seemed out of control, and he just instituted these horrific draconian drug laws. It was Reagan and Bush and kind of, a kind of Republican incentive to do a drug war, and meanwhile Democrats jumping on board for all the wrong reasons as well. So it's just dated back a long time, and it really felt like we were pulling out of it. And I think we're actually pulling out of it around most of the country, because around the country you see governors, mayors, both Democrat and Republican, turning their back on the drug war now. But unfortunately, with Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions, somehow we got to flip back into drug war mode in a way that makes me very sad.
Yeah, when I started FFF 27 years ago, those of us that were calling it into the war on drugs were a lonely bunch, and you caused me to recollect that famous exchange between Milton Friedman and Bill Bennett, the drug czar, in the Wall Street Journal.
Oh yeah.
And so I had the same feeling you did when Sessions comes in. I said, oh my gosh, here's Bill Bennett. But I agree with you. Everything's changed. I mean, today, drug legalization is on the table. People from all walks of life are realizing what a horror this thing has been. And, I just finished watching that series Narcos.
Uh-huh.
And it's such a great demonstration. It's on Netflix of that no matter how many busts they make, there's always people ready to take the place of the person who's busted, and the more the price goes up, the more people are lured into it. So it's a never-ending process.
Well, Jay, I gotta say, one of the things I've loved about being involved in this issue is the way that it's attracted both support and opposition, but when I focus on the support from across the political spectrum. I mean, I think about, when I first started speaking out on this issue back in 1987 and 88, when I was just starting to teach at Princeton. And I remember at that time we were a pretty lonely group. My key ally was Kurt Schmoke, the new mayor of Baltimore, African-American, former chief prosecutor, Rhodes Scholar. But my other key allies were William Buckley and Milton Friedman. Right, and then to some extent Ira Glasser, the head of the ACLU, and so we were across the political spectrum, and basically agreed on the absurdity of the drug war, different views about how far to go or what legalization would mean, but very much in agreement on the critique. And I think this issue has continued to be that. I'm very proud of the fact that George Shultz has been on the honorary board of Drug Policy Alliance for a very long time. And he first stepped out on this issue back in 1989 with his own op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. So it's one of those issues where, Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico, who then became the Libertarian candidate for president, he was my first allied governor going back to 1999, early 2000. And then you got all the guys on the left and the Democrats who got the guts to step out occasionally. So it's really a remarkable issue where I think the common element there is clarity of thinking about what's going on, and distinguishing between the harms of drugs and the harms of failed prohibitionist policies.
Yeah, you mentioned the racist aspects of this war, and one of the things that has always impressed me about the Drug Policy Alliance is that you do focus on that, and that's one of the ways that I really feel about this drug war. It really is a racist war, at least in terms of consequences, and you guys have really emphasized that. We've had some success of late of having drug war conferences in historically black colleges and universities. We did one at Morgan State and another one we're doing next week at Florida A&M University. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the drug war?
Yeah, well, as I said before, I think the elements of racism in the drug war date back to the origins, right? As I was saying about the history with the Chinese and with black people and Mexican Americans. So it's been that all throughout racism. Then secondly, if you look at why are not just certain drugs criminalized, but why are the penalties as hard as they are? I mean, one of the absurd ones was the notion of treating crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine. Right? And not because crack cocaine is any different. It's just it's the same drug, right? It would be like treating the difference between beer and hard liquor 100 times more differently. And so, that was all about who was perceived to be using these drugs. If you look at how is it possible that the United States, which, basically our rates of incarceration were not that different than the rest of the world for much of our history. But then in the last 30, 40 years, we've become the leading incarcerated in the world, both in terms of absolute numbers and also per capita. And I think, the fact that half the people locked up in America are black, even though they're only 13% of the population, I think people are tolerate that because it feels like it's those people, not us white people type thing, you know. So you have that element of the racism of the thing. You have the imagery that when it no longer became permissible in American society to use racial epithets, instead what people began to say was junkie or drug dealer or pusher, knowing that the imagery that would come to mind in most parts of the country was of a young black or brown man, right? So it became almost a new code for allowing racism to sort of be perpetuated in our society. And so I think it's so for us, I mean, the analytically, the link between racism and the drug war has been evident right from the get-go. Then the question has been, in our advocacy, how does that influence our advocacy? Right? And there it's always been challenging because if you're trying to get, white, rural or suburban people in upstate New York or other parts of the country to roll back on the drug war, the fact that it's mostly hurting black people is something that makes them feel indifferent. So we have to put it in their own white terms. On the other hand, if we're mobilizing in New York City or most major urban areas, the fact that there's this racial disproportionality is something that's a major part of the campaigns. If we're running marijuana legalization in Alaska, or Oregon, you're not going to hear that much about race. We're running it in DC, you're going to hear a lot about race. So there's the key about analytically understanding all the ways in which the drug war is permeated by racism in its origins, in its manifestation, and then thinking strategically in our messaging about how and where do we address the issues of race in order to advance our broader drug policy reform agenda.
Yeah, in the early days of the drug war post-Nixon, I mean, you could understand blacks in the inner cities being concerned about drug addiction and the natural inclination being to turn to the police to try to enforce these laws. But I think more and more of them have realized that the cure is worse than the disease. And you've got Michelle Alexander that's written that great book on the new Jim Crow. So yeah. I think they could be a real catalyst to pushing this thing over the cliff.
It really has moved that way because I think, what happened was people were, especially black people in inner cities, were totally flipped out, both during the heroin episode in the 60s, 70s, even more so with crack cocaine. And there was also some element of a conspiratorial thinking that somehow, that the white government was putting these drugs into these neighborhoods, that it was, that there was a plot. And I think there was a hope that if only that we put enough cops in place that would somehow solve the problem. But as you said, Jacob, people have wised up, and in fact, blacks were wising up to this much faster than white people by and large, that bringing in the cops and spending all this money on locking people up was doing nothing to reduce the drug problem, nothing to reduce drug availability, nothing to reduce drug addiction, nothing to help people, but it was resulting in shipping hundreds of thousands of black people, especially young black men, to, out of the way prisons in rural areas where, equally uneducated young white men would be paid to be prison guards. And that was just not a very thoughtful or intelligent allocation of resources.
Yeah, it really is the new Jim Crow. And there's that famous case in Talia, Texas, where they set up an entire section of the community of blacks to get rid of them by sending them to the penitentiary. And it was all cooked up. It was just a total frame. And fortunately, those people got released.
Right, an outright racist. I mean, look, I heard recently that Michelle Alexander's book has now sold 1 million copies.
Wow.
So for a book that's essentially a policy book and a call to arms, I mean, that book has had a monumental impact. And now you have more and more people, some of my colleagues at Drug Policy Alliance, former colleagues, Deborah Small, Cassandra Federic, Asha Bandelli, Art Way, they're out there just, speaking truth to power on this stuff. Very prominent, Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative, Van Jones, the CNN commentator. These are guys who get it, and they're out there speaking to this stuff. Some of the political leaders, both on Capitol Hill or in, at state and local government. So we're seeing a lot of real leadership in the African American community, and the Hispanic and Latino community was much slower to get on board. And now in the last few years, we're seeing a major movement in that area as well.
Yeah, and you've got that LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, law enforcement officers or former that are calling for ending the drug war. Talk a little bit about the violence associated with the war. You mentioned the Prohibition, which was filled with violence. We've seen plenty of that in the drug war too, haven't we?
Well, I mean, it's just, if you make a market illegal, what's going to happen? What happens when two drug dealers have a dispute? One doesn't say to the other, I'm going to take you to court. What they land up doing is oftentimes resolving their dispute with violence, right? If you can't you can't call the police if somebody's going to rip you off. Therefore, you pay criminal organizations to protect you. So, it's everything about when you make this commodity illegal, you invite criminal and violent, not criminal, but violent activity. And that's been true in America, in the inner cities, and more broadly. And it's been horrifically true in places like Mexico and Central America and Colombia, and now parts of West Africa and parts of Asia. I mean, it's been a driving force in many areas behind really horrific violent crime and behind the empowerment of criminal organizations and the corruption of governments. So, whatever benefits we derive from drug prohibition in terms of kicking the price up or making availability a little less, the downsides in terms of the criminal violence and corruption and all of that is just monumental.
Yeah, I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border, and I mean they've just destroyed Mexico. It used to be a fun place to visit for tourists like Nuevo Laredo, and nobody dares go down into Mexico
No,
for
I
tourism
know.
anymore. It's really
It's
a
such,
shame.
I mean, Mexico is an amazing place, and I still go there often. And obviously, there's huge parts of Mexico that are still safe to go. But Tijuana you can basically go to. But to see what happened, Ciudad Juarez, which became the murder capital of the world for a few years. As you said, Nuevo Laredo with real problems. So it's there's other parts of the country that are really problematic now. And at this point, the drug markets, the illicit drug markets and drug prohibition played a major role in empowering these gangsters. And now many of them gone to the point where the drug sales and the drug dealing is becoming a diminishing part of their overall revenue because they've now had the drug selling gave them the capital to expand into other activities, both legal and illegal. And now you have a feeling that the government really doesn't even have the capacity to control this anymore.
Yeah, one of the real ironies of this is that the officials say they're waging the war on drugs to put these drug dealers out of business, which they never do because they're always replaced when they bust one. But the real irony is that they could put them all out of business by simply legalizing drugs, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting because, with the legalization of marijuana now, you already hear that there's much less and less marijuana coming across the border from Mexico. You even start to hear a few stories about high-grade marijuana going from the U.S. down to Mexico, right? But obviously, legalizing these drugs would take this market away from them because in the end, they don't have the know-how to survive in a competitive legal market. Their competitive expertise is in the employment of violence and intimidation and avoiding surveillance by government authorities, right? That's where they have the edge. Once the market becomes legal, it becomes about distribution and marketing in legal channels and how well you can deal with regulatory authorities. And so as this stuff becomes legalized, we're seeing it with marijuana, and hopefully it'll happen with some other drugs as well. The people who are going to win out are the ones who know how to play ball in a legal environment. I think some of the people who've been active illegally will make the transition, and hopefully that will not include the bigger gangsters. I mean, we're seeing in some of the states in the United States where we're legalizing marijuana that the folks who are involved in it illegally, some of them are able to make the transition, but others land up getting pushed out of the market. And it's something I actually feel a little bad about because, you have people, family sometimes been growing weed for decades and earning a decent living and not ripping people off and not stealing and not hurting anybody. And now we're moving towards legalization and regulation and paying taxes and all that. And some of those folks are going to get pushed out. It's one of my regrets in all of this. In drafting the California initiative, one of the things we did was we wrote in there, kind of with a licensing scheme, something whereby the bigger you were, the higher the license fee, and the smaller you were, the less you had to pay. So we tried to make it possible for people who have, properties that are less than 100 by 100 square feet can still play a role in this legal market. Whether they'll be able to survive as the market becomes ever more competitive, I don't know, but we'll see.
Well, you talked about the inhumanity of this war, and one of the aspects, of course, is that people buy polluted drugs, and often what's called an overdose is really just taking a polluted drug. And in a legitimate legalized market, that very rarely happens.
Yeah, no, that's right. It doesn't. Although, Jacob, I've had to refine my message about that a bit because I used to emphasize the adulterated drugs, and it is definitely a problem. But what people need to know, by the way, is that most of more people died last year of an overdose than died of gunshot or died in an auto accident. It's the #1 cause of accidental death in America right now are fatal drug overdoses, mostly involving either pharmaceutical opioids or heroin. What people need to know, just so your listeners know this, is that most fatal overdoses actually should be called fatal drug combinations because it's unusual to overdose by taking too much oxy or too much heroin. It typically people overdose because they combine it with alcohol or they combine it with tranquilizer drugs, benzos and things like that. And when you combine opiates and alcohol or opiates and benzos, if you do it in the right amount, it can make you feel really good. But if you do a little too much, it can stop your breathing. That said, now you have fentanyl, and fentanyl, which is 100 times more potent per gram than is heroin, that's stuff that people are just dying with the needles in their arm. And that's a result of a black market. And quite frankly, with stuff with cocaine, a lot of the dangers around cocaine's not a good drug to fall in love with, that's for sure. But I mean, a lot of the harms that result are from the stuff it's being cut with. People putting stuff in their arms or up their noses and all sorts of bad stuff leading to infections and sometimes death.
All right, at the beginning you talked about what I consider the most powerful case for ending the drug war, and that's the moral case. Would you expand on that and talk to us in terms of freedom of the individual?
Yeah, well, I want to see how boldly I should put this, but
please put it as boldly as you possibly can.
I remember a meeting with and please, I hope people don't take offense at this, but in the environment, it was I was meeting with Barney Frank, right, the liberal congressman from Massachusetts, who was one of our key allies and one of the first to really embrace our agenda. And as I'm leaving his office, and he's very involved in gay rights, was helping us on the marijuana issue and stuff. And as I'm leaving, I said, Barney, I said, basically gay rights, drug policy, marijuana rights. I mean, we're basically all fighting for the same principle. What's that? He goes, his gruff voice. I said, well, basically people shouldn't be punished for what they put in their body, right? But it was that basic point that what you put in your own body is your own business, right? That I, as a human being, and especially an adult human being, have sovereignty over my own mind and body. And the government has got no right to control that. I would also say my employer's got no right to control that, so long as I am doing my job in the workplace and so long as I am fulfilling my obligations. Now, if I get out there and get behind the wheel of a car, I don't have that right if I'm high, right? If I'm beating my children when I'm drunk, I don't have the right to do that. But so long as I'm just putting something in my own body, one time I put it to a group in constitutional terms. I said, one of the greatest things about America is our First Amendment, our freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly, right? And we take that as fundamental. But if you think about it, what underlies that First Amendment is a presumption, which the Founding Fathers never questioned, which is that they had just assumed that we have freedom of consciousness, that we have freedom over our own minds. Right? And now, in a way, if you think about what it means, the right to take drugs and the flip side, which is the right not to take drugs, not the right not to have the government say you have to take a drug, right? The two sides of that same coin, they're basically about individual freedom. And they're basically, I think, what lie at the core of our First Amendment rights in this area. So that's what I think is just fundamental about this. Now, you can go beyond that, right? Which is, I don't come at it from this kind of for many of my libertarian allies, they'll say, Ethan, you talk about sovereignty over mind and body. For them, the right of property, the right of contract is equally important. Where I come from is I say, I start off with the right of sovereignty over mind and body. I then say, if I have the right to put anything in my body, I should have the right to obtain this substance from a legal, reliable source. It's the government's job to figure out how to allow me to do that, to exercise this right. But that's the most moral piece I think that's the underlying moral dimension of this stuff. Then you throw in the fact that the racism of this drug war is immoral. Then you throw in the fact that punishing one adult who sells drugs to another adult the same as a rapist and a murderer is fundamentally immoral and violates basic moral principles. Then you throw in the fact that people have been growing some of these plants, coca, opium, cannabis, in their parts of the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And why are we taking away their livelihoods? So there's all these other corollary moral elements. But for me, it ultimately comes down to your and my sovereignty over our own minds and bodies.
Yeah, I agree with you that a friend of mine once put it that no one's ever gone to the barricades in history for the sake of a cost-benefit analysis. And so while the utilitarian case is important because it shows the futility and the destructiveness of the drug war, really we're ultimately talking about why does the government have the authority to put you in jail simply because you've ingested something that the majority of people may not approve of?
Exactly, exactly. And I found in my advocacy, I almost never lead with the moral argument. I typically lay out the rational arguments, the cost benefit ones, the ineffectiveness, the high cost, and the counterproductiveness. I win people over as much as I can with those policy arguments to the rational brain. And then before I conclude, I hit them with the moral punch. I find if I hit them with a moral punch and they already have the resistance to it, it's a little too much to come in with. But if I bring them along on all the rational stuff and then close with the moral punch, they're a lot more open and a lot more receptive.
Yeah, I think people are naturally they want to know what's practical. Now you mentioned let's wrap up. You mentioned a TED Talk. What is a TED Talk, and what is the talk that you gave, and can people see it online?
Yeah, well, a lot of people, these TED Talks have been going on for 10 or 15 years, and if you people, they're very well put together. They're delivered in front of an audience of a few hundred or a few thousand people. But if you just Google on TED Talk, you'll see what they are. And they have really brilliant talks on thousands of subjects, from, new technology to culture to music to politics to better ways of living, you name it. Some of the most brilliant people around have done these talks, but also people who are not well known at all. And so I had a chance to give one of these TED Talks at their global conference in Rio de Janeiro back in late 2014. And so if you watch it, it's now been watched 1.5 million times, been translated into 27 languages. So if you just Google on Ethan and TED Talk, or Nadelmann and TED Talk, or Nadelmann and TED, you'll easy to find. Yeah, but I encourage, it's a quick 14, 15-minute talk, it was probably the single tightest summation of the drug policy reform argument I've ever given.
Yeah, I consider it one of the best talks on ending the drug war around. Ethan, it's been a real pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for taking the time to give us your perspectives.
Well, thank you, Jacob. Thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for being my ally in this cause for so many years.
All right.